In 1961, a public debate took place in Canada that is little known today, but whose lessons and legacy should rightly resound throughout the Jewish generations. The event was precipitated by the arrival in Quebec of the British scholar Arnold Toynbee, then a public celebrity and the most famous historian in the world, known for his multi-volume study that sought to explain all of human history. Toynbee had argued that every civilization necessarily experiences the four states of genesis, growth, breakdown, and death. Toynbee, of course, was aware that there seemed to be exceptions to this principle, and that there was at least one particular people that appeared to have defied these general rules and continued to endure. And that, of course, is the Jews. Toynbee, however, portrayed Judaism as a fossil civilization, a remnant from the past, which, in his view, had not fully died and yet was not really alive. Following the destruction of the temple, according to Toynbee, the Pharisaic or rabbinic Jews renounced and rejected politics for pacifism, nationalism for nonviolence, statehood for spiritual law. For Toynbee, through their rigid dedication to rabbinic law, Jews became a fossil, frozen in time, with no vibrancy of a true civilization. And the father of this fossilized form of Judaism for Toynbee was Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, who had stolen out of Jerusalem before it fell to the Romans in 70 CE and established an academy in Yavne, elsewhere in the Holy Land. Toynbee describes this purportedly quietistic form of Judaism in the following way, quote, "Before the net of Roman circumvallation fully closed in on the devoted holy city, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai independently took the momentous decision to break with the tradition of militancy which Judas Maccabeus had inaugurated," end quote. And Toynbee added that, quote, "In act and word, Yochanan Ben Zakkai was proclaiming his conversion from the way of violence to the way of gentleness, and through this conversion, he became the founder of the new Jewry, which survived, albeit only as a fossil," end quote. Those are Toynbee's words, albeit only as a fossil. And this fossil for Toynbee was the Judaism of the next 2,000 years. This is, of course, preposterous. Yochanan Ben Zakkai is indeed the father of post-temple Judaism, but the notion that this form of faith existed in rejection of all that came before is utterly untrue. The very rabbinic Judaism of which Rabbi Yochanan was patriarch and progenitor celebrated throughout the centuries the victories of Judas Maccabeus. Even as the rabbis, as we discussed last week, did not celebrate the Hasmonean monarchy that evolved, nevertheless they continued from generation to generation to mark the miraculous victory of the war against Greek tyranny. But Toynbee's depiction and approach to what Judaism became played into his own anti-Zionism. Once a member of the British Foreign Office who had opposed the Balfour Declaration, Toynbee denounced the founding of Israel as immoral, as not in continuity with Jewish history, and he even compared the IDF to Nazis. When visiting McGill University in Montreal, Toynbee was asked if he stood by his description of Judaism as a fossil and of Israelis as akin to Nazi Germany. The historian answered in the affirmative, and this made it to the attention of Yaakov Herzog, a young man still in his 30s, serving as Israel's ambassador to Canada. As Herzog's biographer, Michael Bar Zohar, tells us, quote, Herzog was appalled. "A foreign ambassador," he said to a friend, "cannot remain in a country in which such things have been said about his people. An ambassador cannot remain in a country in which his nation's honor is violated not only from a political standpoint, but from the standpoint of its moral and historical character. If he keeps silent and stays on, it's as if he concurred with the shedding of his people's blood," end quote. And so Herzog issued a public statement insisting that, quote, "Professor Toynbee's statement has nothing to do with morality or the facts," and he added that in view of the gravity of Professor Toynbee's declaration, "I challenge him to debate me openly in a public venue of his choice." Toynbee ultimately agreed, and they met at the McGill Hillel House. During the debate, Toynbee focused on the morality of Israel's founding, and Herzog, even though he defended the creation of Israel and the morality of that moment with great eloquence, Herzog also kept turning back to the history of Rabbinic Judaism, attempting to illustrate that its civilization was anything other than a fossil. And we must understand his motivation, which is that Ambassador Herzog was more than merely an ambassador of a newborn modern state. He was also the son of Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog, originally chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine, and then the first chief rabbi of Israel. One of the great Talmudic scholars of his generation, a leader of religious Zionism, and a hero to his son. I have spent some time reading Ambassador Herzog's speeches, and it's quite clear that in his view, Yochanan Ben Zakkai served as his father's inspiration, as Chief Rabbi Herzog's inspiration. Therefore, Ambassador Herzog took the intellectual and spiritual legacy of Yochanan Ben Zakkai quite personally, and he took great pains in his Montreal debate to defend the vitality of all that Yochanan Ben Zakkai had brought about. You can all go on YouTube and listen to the entire debate, for it was in the end a total triumph for Herzog. And reportedly, as the event came to the close, Toynbee's wife was heard saying something to her husband like, "I told you you shouldn't have debated him." We too today will praise the legacy of Yochanan Ben Zakkai, the statesman, scholar, teacher, visionary, who is indeed the father of the Judaism that we live today. But we will seek to better understand his actions in Judaism's great moment of exile and learn how, rather than producing the fossilization of the Jews, Yochanan Ben Zakkai was actually the one man who prevented it, ensuring the continuity of the people of Israel so that they could endure, live, spiritually thrive, and return to Israel in our age. What do we know of Yochanan Ben Zakkai? Of his origins, little is told, though we are informed that he was one of the youngest and best students of the great sage Hillel in Jerusalem. Hillel had served as Nasi, patriarch, head of the Sanhedrin, and because Hillel was a descendant of David, a rule had been instituted that only Hillel's descendants would serve in this position, thereby emphasizing the Jewish political and religious link to Jerusalem where David had himself once reigned. Thus, in the last years of the Second Temple, even as Yochanan would have been Hillel's greatest living disciple, nevertheless leadership of the Sanhedrin would have been placed in the hands of Hillel's descendants, Shimon and his son Gamliel. Then, in 66 CE, what was known as the Great Jewish Revolt against Rome began in Judea. Open resistance to the brutality and religious insensitivity of the Roman procurator Gessius Florus. Many different groups, many different Jewish factions opposed the Romans, and several of them were known as zealots, led by rival leaders Shimon bar Giora and Yochanan of Gush Chalav. In contrast to the zealots, the rabbis of Jerusalem advocated making peace and surrendering to the Romans. And when that was refused by the zealot groups, Yochanan Ben Zakkai sought to escape, to lay the foundations of Judaism for after Jerusalem fell. Rabbinic literature contains no less than 4 versions of this tale, and though the differences between them are interesting, I believe that by and large they each inform the other. I take them as at times literal, at times symbolic descriptions of Ben Zakkai's worldview, which allow us to create a composite of his personality and perspective. And because we are considering, as Toynbee claimed to be doing, the impact of the worldview of Rabbi Yochanan on generations of Jews, we can therefore look first and foremost to the text that proved most influential over the generations, which is the version of the tale found in the Babylonian Talmud, which places Yochanan in the midst of the Roman siege, with Jerusalem dying of starvation, and the zealots executing any fellow Jews who would attempt to escape the city and surrender to the Romans. Yochanan therefore contacted a relative of his who was a member of the zealots. I cite sections of the Talmudic text. Quote, "The Biryoni," this means the zealots, "were then in the city. The rabbi said to them, 'Let us go out and make peace with the Romans.' They, the zealots, would not let them, but on the contrary said, 'Let us go out and fight them.' The rabbi said, 'You will not succeed.' They, the zealots, then rose up and burnt the stores of wheat and barley, so that a famine ensued." This means that the Zealots destroyed the food belonging to their Jewish political opponents, and as we shall see, this Talmudic tale accords with other historical sources. At this point, Rabbi Yochanan decided that Jerusalem was doomed, and he reached out to a relative, a member of the Zealots. We continue the tale. Rabbi Yochanan sent to him, saying, "Come to visit me privately." When he came, he said to him, "How long are you going to carry on in this way and kill all the people with starvation?" He replied, "What can I do? If I say a word to them, they will kill me." Meaning, if I speak up to the Zealot leadership, I'll be killed myself. Rabbi Yochanan said, "Devise some plan for me to escape. Perhaps I shall be able to save a little." This phrase, "save a little," is a word that appears often in versions of Rabbi Yochanan's story. The Aramaic, "Hatzalah purta," can best, I think, be translated as, "save whatever we can save." Jerusalem, he was convinced, would fall, and so he sought to save whatever could be saved. The phrase has a haunting echo 2,000 years later, when during the Holocaust, Chief Rabbi Herzog, the ambassador's father, visited FDR in Washington. And according to his biographer, Shaul Mezlich, this is what he said, quote, "I call upon his honor as someone in a position of power, in the name of human conscience, in the name of human liberty, in the name of justice, to prevent the butchering of the Jews and allow the survivors the possibility of reaching safe havens. Mr. President," said Rabbi Herzog, "I am not the person who will advise you on how to deal with this terrible problem. I come only with a plea and also a warning. The plea, save what can be saved. The warning, those who stood by will be held accountable in the future." Here, Yochanan Ben Zakkai hears history's call, and he seeks to save what can be saved. Rabbi Herzog went to FDR. Rabbi Yochanan, millennia earlier, attempts something even more audacious, to seek out the very Roman rulers who were about to destroy Jerusalem, to ask for permission to save what could be saved. The problem was that the Zealots would slaughter any Jews seeking to surrender. Only dead bodies were allowed out of the city. Rabbi Yochanan's relative, therefore, suggests that he, Rabbi Yochanan, pretend to die. I quote further in the Talmudic tale. He said to him, "Pretend to be ill and let everyone come to inquire about you. Bring something evil-smelling and put it by you so that they will say you are dead. Let then your disciples get under your bed," meaning carry the coffin, "but no others, so that they shall not notice that you are still light, since they know that a living being is lighter than a corpse." He did so, and Rabbi Eliezer, his student, went under the coffin from one side, and Rabbi Joshua from the other. When they reached the door, meaning the gate to Jerusalem, some men wanted to put a lance, a spear, through the coffin to ensure that he was dead. He, Rabbi Yochanan's relative from the Zealots, said, "Shall the Romans say they have pierced their master?" So instead they wanted to give it a push to ensure that he was dead. He, again Rabbi Yochanan's relative, said, "Shall they say that they pushed their master?" They opened the gate for him, and he got out. We must pause again to ponder this image. Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai escapes the downfall of Jerusalem by pretending to be dead. The future rebirth of Rabbinic Judaism is born out of Jerusalem on a coffin, life and death inextricably bound up with each other. The coffin, some suggest, embodies the death of the immediate hope and dream of independence, of overthrowing Rome. The death, indeed, of preserving Jewish Jerusalem, at least for now, of preserving the temple, at least for now. It is, in other words, an assumption that the temple, the locus of Jewish aspirations, is about to burn. And this union of faith with hard-headed realism is essential to understanding Yochanan Ben Zakkai. There's a fascinating book called Learned Optimism by Martin Seligman, the father of positive psychology. Seligman recounts therein how he was interested in studying resilience, optimism, a refusal to give up, and how that can impact success in life. And so he thought to himself, what profession experiences rejection more than any other? And the answer, he realized, was insurance salesman. And so he decided to study that. He partnered with MetLife to create psychological profiles of job applicants, salesmen, people seeking to be salesmen. And he worked with salesmen choosing them not based on their intelligence, but rather based on what he called their explanatory style. Salesmen for whom rejection and failure that they experienced, they thought was not their fault, but rather a result of temporary external factors, so that it only inspired them to work harder. The experiments were an extraordinary success, and MetLife hired optimistic insurance salesmen based on Seligman's guidance. Now here's what's interesting. I read in an article how MetLife also asked Seligman to apply his methods at the company's leadership level to ensure only instinctively optimistic executives. And he said no, because in leadership, having only optimism would be disastrous. In his book, Seligman puts it this way, quote, "In many arenas of life, optimism is unwarranted. At times, we do fail irretrievably, and seeing those times through rose-colored glasses may console us but will not change them. In some situations, the cockpit of an airliner, for example, what's needed is not an upbeat view but a mercilessly realistic one. Sometimes we need to cut our losses and invest elsewhere, rather than find reasons to hold on." End quote. The realist that was Rabbi Yochanan was willing to die in order to live, to give up at least for a period on an independent Jerusalem, to prepare for the long, hard centuries to come. But why was Rabbi Yochanan so sure that the Zealots' revolt would fail? Why had he eschewed the optimism of the rebels? Did he himself not celebrate David's victory over Goliath, Hezekiah's over Assyria, Judah's over the Seleucids? Why is he so sure that Jerusalem will fall? And moreover, the Romans, even if they win, usually in conquering a city, do not raze it to the ground. So why was he so convinced that surrender was preferable, and that if surrender would not occur, the ravaging of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple was all but certain? So when we continue the story in the Talmud, a historical hint is given to us. We are told that he came before the general overseeing the assault on Jerusalem, Vespasian, who would become emperor, and actually impressed Vespasian with the prediction that he was about to become emperor. Thus the Talmud tells us, when he reached the Romans, he said, "Peace to you, O king, peace to you, O king." At this we are told Vespasian started. But then moments later, quote, "A messenger came to him from Rome saying, 'Up, for the emperor is dead and the notables of Rome have decided to make you head.'" End quote. And I think what the text is attempting symbolically to communicate to us is that it was, Rabbi Yochanan realized, Vespasian's very rise to the throne that would ensure the utter destruction of the Roman assault. And here, too, Talmudic text accords with history. The Oxford historian Martin Goodman, in his excellent book about the Roman-Jewish War, notes that the notion of Vespasian as an all-powerful emperor who brought Judea to its knees and founded an imperial dynasty would have been unthinkable several years before 69 to 70. In fact, Goodman informs us, quote, "Vespasian had been appointed in 66 by Nero to command the Roman forces against the rebellious Jews, partly because of his political insignificance. The son of a tax farmer, he was in his late 50s and had enjoyed a worthy but not a brilliant career," end quote. And so Nero, who was worried about his own assassination, which ultimately did occur, chose Vespasian precisely because he thought that he could never be a threat to his own imperial rule. That is why he chose. As Goodman tells us, that is why he, quote, "preferred to entrust the control of 3 legions for the Judean war to Vespasian, precisely because he was a competent mediocrity. That such a man might become emperor without breeding or context among the aristocracy was unimaginable," end quote. But, he goes on to explain, after Nero's assassination and the destruction of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, then suddenly Vespasian's candidacy for the throne became more plausible, but he needed a resume. What Goodman calls, quote, "the gloss of foreign conquest, the surest foundation of authority for a Roman politician, for him to be portrayed in the capital as warrior, hero, and savior of the state," end quote. Thus, even as Vespasian made his way back to Rome, he left behind his son Titus, instructing him to establish a political pedigree through achieving victory as quickly as possible. Thus, Goodman writes, quote, "At the heart of Titus's eventual victory was thus the ruthlessness of his assault, which paid little heed either to damage caused to the city or to the losses on his own side," end quote. This, the very fact that Vespasian needed Jerusalem's destruction in order to survive as emperor, in order to create a resume of victory and brutality, this, I think, is what alerted Rabbi Yochanan to the fact that what faced the Jews was not merely military defeat and subjugation, but the destruction of their sacred city itself. But there is more. As we've previously discussed, Jerusalem was originally conquered by King David as a symbol, to stand as a symbol of Jewish unity. And Jerusalem, therefore, he felt, could not stand if it was a site of Jewish hatred for and violence against one another. Josephus describes how the rival factions slaughtered each other even as they fought Rome, and they burnt, as we mentioned, each other's foods. Recall Yochanan's statement to the Zealots. How long will you cause all of us, he says during the siege, to die of starvation? He blames the hatred of rival factions for each other, for the starving, not the Romans. And Josephus says the same, quote, "It was as if to oblige the Romans they were destroying all that the city had laid up against a siege and hamstringing their own powers." The result, he writes, at any rate, was that all the buildings round the temple were burnt to the ground. The city became a desolate no man's land where they flung themselves at each other's throats, and almost all the grain, enough to support them through many years of siege, went up in flames. And he adds, it was hunger that defeated them, a thing that could never have happened if they had not brought it about themselves. In their hatred for each other, the Jews of Jerusalem brought it upon themselves. 2,000 years later, that moment would be cited by Menachem Begin when he stood on the ship Altalena as Ben-Gurion's forces fired upon him. And Begin ordered those who followed his orders not to fire back. The ship on which he stood carried much-needed arms for the battle in Jerusalem, but Begin essentially said that if they allowed civil war to descend, if they allowed Jews to fight Jews, then Jerusalem would not deserve to be saved. Jewish hatred, even more than Rome, destroyed ancient Jerusalem. And Yochanan Ben Zakkai, seeing a Jerusalem where Jews slaughtered Jews, sensed that the city would fall not only because of the brutality of Vespasian's assault, but because a Jerusalem that had eschewed Jewish unity had no right to expect the miracle of the Almighty's intervention. Thus, in another rabbinic text describing Ben Zakkai's flight, he ultimately returns with his student to see the smoldering ruins of the temple, and he consoles his student with the message that loving kindness will need to replace sacrifices. Toynbee, in his books, loves this source, cites this statement as a symbol of Ben Zakkai giving up the political and military past. But this is entirely wrong. As we shall see, he never gave up on Jerusalem. The sage's point in this passage is that if they would never learn to love one another, then they could never aspire to deserve Jerusalem again. Jews could only deserve Jerusalem if they could unite. Jews that killed each other, that destroyed the food belonging to one another, had no right to expect that God would allow them to remain independent in Jerusalem. So if my analysis is correct, then Yochanan Ben Zakkai emerges as both militarily and politically astute, but also spiritually attuned to all that Jerusalem was and could be. Escaping Jerusalem, he stands before Roman military leaders, and whereas in one rabbinic source he does first plead for Jerusalem, in the Talmud his requests are seemingly more modest, but two of them resound throughout our history. The first and most famous, Tein li Yavne v'chachameha, give me Yavne and its sages, meaning he's asking the Romans, allow me to establish an academy, a yeshiva, on the coast in the town of Yavne, where Torah will be taught and transmitted. This is the essence of the rabbinic worldview, that the Jewish people are chosen, and the Torah is the embodiment of that chosenness. Therefore, if the Jewish people can endure without independence for now, they still cannot endure without the Torah. Thus did Torah study begin in Yavne. But we must understand, ladies and gentlemen, that what took place there was much more than rote repetition. There in Yavne was born the originality and diversity of Jewish learning. A couple years ago, I hosted a very prominent non-Jewish political columnist at Yeshiva University. He came on Hanukkah, and it was very interesting as I showed him around, took him from place to place. It was interesting seeing the oddities of Jewish life through non-Jewish eyes. So I took him into a Hanukkah party, and I took him over to the latkes, and I explained to him, I said, these are latkes. They're potato pancakes that are deep fried in oil. We eat them because on Hanukkah the miracle happened with oil, so to commemorate this, we eat foods fried in oil. And he looks at me and he says, no, seriously, why do you eat them? And he couldn't even conceive that this would be so flimsy an excuse the Jews would use just to eat incredibly unhealthy food. But I also took him into the Beit Midrash of the yeshiva, the study hall. You walk right in, and to him, at first glance, it looks like a library. But then you realize that the students are sitting over these books, and they are yelling at each other. They are shouting, each taking their own approach to the text, providing their own interpretation. And he looked at me, my guest, and he said, how do they concentrate? And it was striking to me because actually if you're used to the clamor of the yeshiva of the study hall, you actually can't concentrate without it. You can't just sit and focus in the quiet without the din. It is this cacophony of the study hall, which to Jews is harmony. That is what Yavne brought about. And the hint of this is found in Pirkei Avot, which is known as the Ethics of the Fathers. We are told, quote, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai had 5 disciples, namely Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Yoshua ben Hananiah, Rabbi Yosei the priest, Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. He, Rabbi Yochanan, used to recount their praise. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is a plastered well that never loses a drop. Yoshua ben Hananiah, happy the one who gave him birth. Yosei the priest, a pious man. Shimon ben Netanel, a man who fears sin. Elazar ben Arach, an ever-flowing spring. This is what we are told about his students. And the passage seems incongruent with the genre of Avot, which usually provides us with religious maxims, not praise for students. But rightly understood, what is being given here is a moral maxim. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, who cites this passage, puts it this way, quote, it is easy to have students who are uncritical devotees, but never become creative intellects in their own right. It is not difficult to create followers. It is far harder to create leaders. Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai was a great teacher, he writes, because 5 of his students became giants in their own right. The Mishnah, meaning this passage, is telling us how he did it. He showed each of his pupils where their particular strength lay. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, the plastered well that never loses a drop, was gifted with a superb memory, an important gift in an age in which manuscripts were rare and the oral law was not yet committed to writing. Shimon ben Netanel, the man who feared sin, may not have had the intellectual brilliance of the others, but his reverential nature was a reminder to others that they were not mere scholars, but also holy men engaged in a sacred task. Elazar ben Arach, the ever-flowing spring, had a creative mind, constantly giving rise to new interpretations of ancient texts. End quote. Thus, it is in Yavne, ladies and gentlemen, that an educational philosophy is created that emphasizes, yes, Torah study, but also difference, creativity, innovation, creating thereby an intellectual culture that would define the next 2,000 years of Jewish learning, all linked to one Torah text, and yet dazzling in its diversity. What Yochanan Ben Zakkai is doing, therefore, is actually creating the exact opposite of what Toynbee associates with his achievement. The intellectual vibrancy of Jewish learning, and therefore the diversity of learning that followed him, is not the story of a fossil, but indeed of an intellectual culture that is awe-inspiring. And this point was made by Herzog in his debate with Toynbee. And if you listen, as I urge you to do, you'll be struck by Ambassador Herzog's eloquence and also his wonderful Irish accent. Because actually, Ambassador Herzog grew up in Ireland because his father, the great Rabbi Herzog, before he became chief rabbi in Mandate Palestine, served as the chief rabbi of Ireland, a job that was described by a later chief rabbi of Ireland as involving being the chief rabbi of a country that's 93% Catholic, 7% Protestant, and the rest is Jewish. So he grew up in Ireland, and then they went to the land of Israel. And so he has this wonderful accent when you speak. And they are speaking to the man, to Toynbee, who had considered Judaism an ossified form of faith. The young, brash, eloquent ambassador of Israel said the following, quote, if you think of Jewish civilization in terms of its impact on world civilization down the ages, the terms of its creativity, and sir, you will pardon me if I observe that in your work you do not mention any creative Jewish activity since about 2,300 years ago, actually since Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai. You do not mention, said Herzog to Toynbee, you do not mention the academies of learning in Palestine, in Jerusalem, Safed, learning in mysticism, Mishnah, Talmud, Jerusalem Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, Targum, Masorah, poetry, the first Paitanim who laid the basis for modern Jewish poetry, right down the ages, and Hasidim and the whole movement of a living body of people. These, he said, are not mentioned by you. All this is true, and all this is the achievement of the culture of learning created by Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai. But that is not the rabbi's only request from the Romans. The fact remains that Ben Zakkai acted not only as a scholar, but statesman, and what he asks of Rome is not only spiritual, but political. Give me Yavna and its sages, he is supposed to have said. But also, he asks, give me the dynasty of Rabbi Gamliel. What this means is that he was asking for the continuation of the politico-spiritual position of the descendants of Hillel, the descendants of King David, as supreme leaders of the Sanhedrin. He asked for this because he saw it as the source of the Holy Land's, of the Jewry of the Holy Land's unity, and for their enduring connection to the Jewish past and to Jerusalem. For only in remembering David could Jerusalem continue to be remembered. It's often said, too often, that Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai created a Judaism in which the synagogue and the study hall replaced the temple. That's not exactly right. The Mishnah records that rituals were instituted by Rabbi Yochanan as a zecher lemikdash, to remember what took place in the temple. In Yavneh, the liturgy was ordained. The prayers were composed to be said towards Jerusalem at the precise time the offerings took place in Jerusalem, and part of what they were saying were prayers for the restoration of Jerusalem. Every aspect of the laws of the sacrifices, of the rituals of the temple, were taught in Yavneh, preserved by the generations, recorded ultimately in the Mishnah. An entire blueprint of the temple, remembering it as it stood, inch by inch, was preserved in one of these tractates, known as Midot, measurements, remembering what once was, and the rabbis ardently believed what would be again. It is in Yavneh that the Hillelian Davidic dynasty was saved, and it is in Yavneh, which was indeed dominated by learning and prayer, but it was in Yavneh that the attachment to Jerusalem and the longing for its restoration was enshrined. Thus, from Yavneh, two complementary facts of Jewish history were created. As Jews spread around the earth, the evolution of vibrant Torah study continued with them. But at the same time, their connection to the land remained, prayers toward Jerusalem remained, a Jewish presence in the land remained. Thus, in the debate about the Jewish right to Israel, Herzog told Toynbee, quote, "Of all the ancient peoples of the Middle East, we are the only one living in continuity today in the Middle East, speaking the same language, practicing the same religious faith." And he added, "Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai," he said to Toynbee, "to whom you devote much attention, he and Rabbi Akiva and Bar Kochva, if they were to come to life and could live with us, would not find a dichotomy that snapped them asunder. There is a continuity of experience." End quote. Yochanan Ben Zakkai is known as a scholar, but he is accorded honor by the Talmud as a statesman because he helped save a Jewish polity and he defined Jewish civilization. When Hillel's heir, Gamliel, arrived in Yavneh, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, wishing to accord honor to Davidic leadership, seems to have stepped off the historical scene, leaving the very academy he created, a Jewish version of Washington giving up power and returning to Mount Vernon. George III famously said when that occurred, "If Washington does that, he will be the greatest man in the world, because no one gives up power." Yochanan Ben Zakkai was one of the greatest Jews in the world, and had he so chosen, he could have replaced the house of Hillel with himself, destroyed the remembrance of the Davidic dynasty. But he knew that the link to Jerusalem would then have potentially been torn asunder. As he died, Yochanan Ben Zakkai's last words on earth, according to the Talmud, were, "Prepare the throne for Hezekiah the king, for he is coming." Hezekiah was the last Davidic king to reign securely over a Jerusalem that was simultaneously truly righteous and politically independent. And Yochanan thereby ended his life by expressing his hope and aspiration that all that he did when Jerusalem fell would sustain Judaism until it rose in Jerusalem again. To save what could be saved, to emphasize the familial unity of the Jewish people, to preserve the ties to David and Jerusalem, and always ensure the teaching and learning of Torah. Only thus will Judaism survive. This is the vision of Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, and it is an example that inspired rabbinic leaders when Jews in the future face disaster, as he once did. Chief Rabbi Herzog, Ambassador Herzog's father, was of course to be disappointed by Roosevelt and by many others. Not all were saved who could be saved. And after the fall of Nazi Germany, the chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine spent 6 months circling Europe looking for orphans. Many Jewish orphans who had been hidden with non-Jews, who were in danger of being lost to their people. And so he circled orphanages and monasteries throughout the continent, just looking for children. Meanwhile, in Palestine, the apparatus of the state was being built. Of course, one might have suggested that they needed their chief rabbi, but Rabbi Herzog, ardent Zionist that he was, understood at the same time that only if he dedicated himself to saving Jews around the world and showed his love for them, could he have reason to merit seeing an independent Jerusalem. 500 children were saved by Chief Rabbi Herzog. 500 children who would have been lost to the Jewish people forever. 500 children placed on a boat to the land of Israel. He saved what he could save, just like his role model. Because Ambassador Herzog said the following about his father. His father, who had been the last chief rabbi of an unfree Jewry in British Palestine and the first chief rabbi of the Third Jewish Commonwealth. He said about his father as follows, quote, "He, the last spiritual leader of the destruction, remembered the first leader of the same destruction, Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai, who before his death almost 2,000 years ago instructed his disciples to prepare a throne for Hezekiah, king of Judah, as a tangible symbol of faith that the kingdom of Israel would surely be restored. In the same way, said Herzog, my father of blessed memory found the strength to soothe the bereaved people from one end of the earth to the other with the assurance of consolation and the approaching of salvation. If his body was bowed by the agony of his people, his soul looked forward with absolute confidence to redemption." End quote. This is indeed who Yochanan Ben Zakkai actually was, a man who allowed Israel to endure without Jerusalem, but who never let them forget Jerusalem, a man bowed by the agony of his people, but who looked onward to redemption, a man who was realistically prepared for Jewish exile, but who sowed the political and spiritual seeds of Jewish return, and gave us an intellectual and religious heritage that is one of the wonders of the world, and reveals the Jewish people over the last 2,000 years to be anything other than a fossil. The hard truth, however, is that it is not only antagonists like Toynbee who misunderstood the legacy of Ben Zakkai. Even some of the heroic founders of Israel failed to understand him and celebrate him. Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who like Rabbi Herzog was one of the post-war leaders of religious Zionism, once reflected with great pain on the fact that Israel's leaders themselves sometimes identified Yochanan Ben Zakkai with defeat and gave him no credit for the achievements of modern Israel. Rabbi Soloveitchik said, quote, "When Chaim Weizmann opened the Israeli Knesset on Tu B'Shvat 5709, he gave a list of all the dreamers and fighters. He reflected a list of all the dreamers and fighters who with their self-sacrifice contributed to the miracle of the State of Israel. He began with the Katowice Conference and the Bilu movement in the 1880s. He managed to name Theodor Herzl, Nachum Sokolov, Achad Ha'am, Chaim Nachman Bialik, Eliezer Ben Yehuda, Menachem Osishkin, Louis Brandeis, and Edmund de Rothschild. But, said Rabbi Soloveitchik, Weizmann forgot to mention all the generations from Rabbi Yochanan Ben Zakkai to Rabbi Mendel of Vitebsk, who fasted and bemoaned the destruction of Jerusalem, who ignored all the persecutions, the mockery and laughter, who continued to hope that tomorrow the temple would be rebuilt, and envisioned the great edifice that would tower over all the mountaintops." End quote. We can, of course, understand why they would overlook Rabbi Yochanan. Many secular Zionists sought in statehood Jewish normalization. And the lesson of Yochanan Ben Zakkai is that we are not normal, that Jews are chosen for the Torah, and that ultimately it is the Torah that embodies our eternity. And only when we combine the story of Yochanan Ben Zakkai with the lessons of modern Zionism can a full appreciation of Jewish statehood be deduced. Several years after the debate, Herzog had another run-in with Toynbee, this time in England. Toynbee asked him why the Jewish claim on the Holy Land is different from any other ancient people's connection to their former country. "After all," Toynbee said to Herzog, "how can I explain to Nasser that here comes a nation after 2,000 years and claims a right to this country? And what shall I tell him," said Toynbee, "if he asks me, what about the Vikings in Norway who settled in England 1,000 years ago? What if the Vikings wanted to go back to London?" And Herzog essentially replied to Toynbee that Toynbee would have a point. If there were still Vikings, logically, said Herzog, "you are right. But there is one small flaw in your argument. There are no Vikings that seek to return to England." "How," he said to Toynbee, "how can you apply to this case the ordinary laws of history, when, as you yourself have written, over scores of empires and cultures have risen and disappeared from the horizons of civilization during the same period in which this little people has continued to exist?" Herzog later reflected on the meaning of this encounter. "So long as the world agrees that there is something unique about the Jews in the history of mankind," he wrote, "it cannot deny the right of the Jews to this land." In other words, if one discards the idea of Jewish uniqueness in human history, then he continued, he said further, if one discards the idea of Jewish uniqueness in human history, it is very difficult to counter the argument of the intellectual. But if, on the other hand, the idea of Jewish uniqueness is accepted, then there is a reply, which is not only the religious Jewish reply, but which has a place in the 20th century, no less than in any previous century." End quote. We are, in other words, a nation apart, exceptional, eternal. The question, Herzog concluded, quote, is whether this concept denotes a privilege, not an escape from society as a whole, but a unique role within it, or whether it is an anomaly which must be denied and discarded. This is the question of Jewish history, end quote. One cannot defend the existence of the Jewish people as a nation, as a political entity, without embracing the fact of Jewish eternity, the fact that Jews defied Toynbee's rules, and all that this fact implies. Toynbee attacked Israel's founding because he refused to come to terms with the miracle that is the Jewish people, and it falls to us, therefore, to defend and understand the very miracle that Israel makes manifest. Why did we survive until now as a people? What is the source of our salvation? And if the Jews have a special, chosen, spiritual calling, what does that tell us about our role in today's day and age? This is what Rabbi Yochanan's example asks of us, if we truly give him the credit he deserves for Jewish preservation and Jewish return. In the archives of Israel's National Library sits a small card which contains on it a handwritten greeting that Jewish children who survived the Holocaust wrote for Rabbi Herzog when they met him during his travels in Europe. These children were orphaned. Their parents were murdered. They had in their young lives experienced more horror than we can imagine. Yet words that embody the centuries of Jewish endurance and yearning sublimely and succinctly were written by them on this card, which you can find in a wonderful discussion about Rabbi Herzog on the National Library of Israel website. The children wrote in simple, humble Hebrew handwriting the following to the chief rabbi who had been inspired by Yochanan Ben Zakkai. Anachnu yaldei she'erit ha'pleta, we the children of the remnant of the exile, smechim ma'od l'kabel hayom pnei Adonenu harav harashi Rabbeinu Herzog, are so very happy to greet our master, the chief rabbi, Rabbi Herzog. V'navtiach lefanav shena'aleh arza v'na'azor b'vinyana, and we promise in the rabbi's presence that we will ascend to the Holy Land and assist in its rebuilding. Yehi ratzon milifnei Avinu shebashamayim May it be the will of our Father in heaven. Shenizkeh lirot b'medina Yehudit mishuchreret lefi ruach Toratenu. That we merit to see an independent Jewish state inspired by the spirit of our Torah. So these children wrote. To face horror and destruction, but to never give up hope. To retain a link to the land, but never forget that it is the spirit of the Torah that inspires us. This is the legacy of Yochanan Ben Zakkai, and that is why, to this very day, his legacy lives still.